It begins with a road no map remembers, a dirt stretch that cuts through the Appalachian wilderness, quiet as a grave, older than the power lines that hang like forgotten veins across the hills. If you followed it, past the rusted gates, past the hollow-eyed barns, you'd find a place the state erased, not from geography, but from memory. They called it odd, though some said the name was a warning. Others whispered that it wasn't the place that was strange, but the blood that ran through it. Back then, before the war and the highways, families didn't leave their valleys. They stayed where the soil was good and the mines still breathed. But in Odd, something else rooted itself, something that grew inward instead of out. By the time the first census taker came through in the early 1900s, he wrote in his journal that the people here share one face. He wasn't exaggerating. Nearly every man, woman, and child bore the same wide, set eyes, the same slack jaw, the same eerie stillness, as if carved from one mold, then left too long in the sun. The census never published that note. It was buried quietly in the state archives under irregular settlement, a bureaucratic term for something no one wanted to name. If you talk to the few who remember, they'll tell you about the Whitakers. The first family, the ones who built their home from the bones of an old coal shack. No one knows when their bloodline began to turn inward, but by the 1930s, it had become a cycle no one dared to break. Children were born who couldn't speak, others who spoke only in sounds that echoed the crows. They didn't go to school. The teachers who tried never came back for a second day. In the winter, the smoke from their chimneys hung low, thick, and sour. Neighbors said it smelled like metal, like something rotting from the inside out. But the strangest thing, the thing that made even the locals keep their distance, was the way they looked at you, not angry, not afraid, just empty, like eyes that had forgotten what they were for. In the 1950s, a social worker was sent to Odd after reports of neglect and unusual behavior. Her notes still survive, though they were never released publicly. In one entry, she described entering the Whitaker property. There were several adults, but none seemed to respond to their names. Communication was done through grunts, gestures, and strange clicking noises. The youngest child, a boy of maybe 10, was sitting in the dirt, rocking. When I asked him where his parents were, he smiled without showing his teeth. Then he pointed to the ground. The report ends there. She never returned. Some say the government came in afterward, quietly, without papers or press, and sealed the area off. Others say the Whitakers simply disappeared, their house left to collapse under its own weight. But there's a rumor that a few of them survived, wandering into nearby towns, living off charity and fear. They never spoke much, but when they did, the words came out broken, like a language chewed up by generations of silence. The truth is, Odd wasn't just a place. It was a wound that never healed. You can still find it on old survey maps, though the roads are gone now. The satellite images blur out the area. Locals claim it's to protect what's left of private land. But those who know the region's history will tell you different. They'll tell you it's because no one wants to see what's still there. Because even now, people who venture too close say they hear voices, not screams, not laughter, just low, rhythmic sounds coming from the hollows, as if something that forgot how to be human is still trying to remember. And if you're wondering how something like that could happen, how an entire community could fold in on itself until its blood became its own prison, then you're asking the same question that haunted me when I found the photos. Black and white, faded at the edges, faces that don't look real but are, eyes that seem to follow you even through the glass. At first glance, you might think it's just poverty, malnutrition, maybe a trick of bad lighting. But then you see the pattern, the repetition, the way the same jawline appears generation after generation. These weren't coincidences, they were consequences, because isolation does strange things to people. It eats at them. It turns family into mirror, mirror into madness, when you can't leave, and when no one will come in the world shrinks until the only blood that exists is your own. That's what happened in Odd. The name wasn't just a word, it was a prophecy, and when the rest of America looked away, when the newspapers ignored it, and the church stopped sending missionaries, the people there did what they had always done. They kept the blood close, too close. One surviving letter from a local doctor, dated 1961, describes a visit to what he called the family with the stare. They do not blink. The younger ones will follow you with their eyes, but will not approach. There is evidence of congenital defects, cleft lips, underdeveloped jaws, and severe cognitive impairment. Yet there is also something else, something in their stillness that feels almost learned. He resigned that same year. By the 1970s, the county stopped listing births from the area entirely. Records disappear. Land deeds go blank. It's as if the soil itself refused to hold their names anymore. But the land remembers. It always does. Sometimes, when the fog settles in the valley just right, it looks like the ground is breathing. Locals swear they've seen figures standing where the Whittaker house once stood. Not ghosts, just shapes, watching, and every few years, someone brave or foolish goes looking for Odd. Most don't find anything but broken fences and silence. But one man, a photographer from North Carolina, said he heard movement in the trees. Branches snapping, footsteps too heavy for animals. When he called out, something answered, not words, just a sound, a low, wet clicking like teeth against teeth. He didn't stay long after that. Some stories are forgotten because they're false. Others because they're true, and too disturbing to face. The story of Odd and the Whittaker family is one of those truths. A reflection of what happens when the human need for belonging turns inward until it becomes something else entirely. Something that looks like us, but isn't. And if you ever find yourself driving through that part of the Appalachian Mountains and you see a dirt road with no sign, no markings, just a single mailbox with the paint worn away, don't turn down it. Because some roads aren't forgotten, they're waiting. If you've made it this far, you're already beginning to understand that Odd wasn't some isolated anomaly. It was the symptom of something much larger. A sickness that once hid itself across the folds of rural America, unspoken, unrecorded, but always there, just beneath the soil, because Odd wasn't the only place like this. It was simply the one people were too frightened to talk about. In the 1930s and 40s, government agents began traveling through the backroads of Appalachia, cataloging settlements for New Deal programs. Their field notes are still in the archives, dry, clinical, but every so often you find a phrase that breaks through the bureaucratic calm. Severe interrelatedness of community, unusual phenotypic uniformity. Those are the words they used when they couldn't bring themselves to write the truth. They were finding entire hamlets where the same surnames stretched across every mailbox. Children who couldn't read, who didn't speak, who flinched from light. Families who lived and died without ever seeing a doctor or a stranger. Some of them buried their dead on their own land, the graves unmarked, the stones blank. But Odd was different. It wasn't just isolation, it was inheritance. An inheritance of silence, carried generation after generation like a curse you couldn't see but could feel in your bones. The Whittakers, they said, had forgotten where the bloodline began. The stories of who married whom blurred into rumor and denial. Cousins became siblings. Siblings became couples. And after enough time, it didn't matter who came first. The branches of the family tree had twisted so tightly together that the roots suffocated. People from neighboring towns knew. They always knew. They just didn't speak of it, because to acknowledge it meant admitting that it wasn't some faraway horror. It was right there, a few miles down the road. And when outsiders came, they didn't stay long. Journalists, preachers, social workers, they all came with their notebooks and good intentions, and they all left with something broken inside them. There's a story about a state trooper who got lost on patrol near the old Whitaker place. It was late, his radio had gone dead, and his car stalled on a stretch of dirt road he didn't recognize. He got out to check under the hood, and that's when he heard its soft, echoing laughter from the trees. Not mocking, not joyful, just wrong, he called out, but there was no answer, only that sound again, low and wet, too close to be an animal. When his flashlight beam hit the edge of the woods, he saw eyes reflecting back. Not 2 dozens, he never went back to that part of the county again. You won't find that story in any official report, but ask the locals and they'll tell you. They always do after dark, after a few drinks, when the lights are low and the crickets have gone quiet. They'll tell you that Odd wasn't forgotten, it was buried on purpose, because by the time the 1980s came around, America had grown too civilized for its own ghosts. The state paved new roads that cut through the old valleys. The maps were redrawn. The name Odd disappeared from official records, and the families still living there were either moved or something else. There's no record of where they went, but every now and then someone claims to see them. A man walking barefoot along the railroad tracks at dawn, a woman standing by the tree line, hair white as snow, her face pale and expressionless, always silent, always watching. One trucker passing through in the early 2000s said he stopped at an abandoned gas station just outside of Raleigh County. There was a payphone still hanging by its cord, and next to it, a single photograph pinned under glass. Faded, torn, but still visible, it showed a group of people, 8, maybe 9. Their faces blurred not from motion, but from deformity. Wide mouths, hollow eyes, heads tilted at unnatural angles, and scrawled on the back in pencil were just 2 words, the family. He took one look, got back in his truck, and didn't stop driving until he hit Tennessee. You might think these are just stories, rural folklore, exaggerations of poverty and tragedy, but that's the thing about forgotten history. It only stays buried because no one goes looking. And when you do, you find that the line between myth and record isn't as clean as we like to believe. There are medical files, photographs, handwritten notes from doctors who refused to publish what they saw. They describe conditions that shouldn't exist outside textbooks: mutations, recessive disorders, genetic collapse. One physician wrote that the youngest of the Whitakers appeared incapable of forming human words, yet demonstrated awareness and communication through guttural mimicry. He was describing a human being, but in his writing you can feel the fear, the same fear that made others turn away, because it's one thing to see deformity, it's another to feel like you're looking at something that shouldn't be alive, and yet is. And that's the story no one wanted told, that a part of America was left to rot in its own bloodline, forgotten by a country too proud to admit what it had done. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? If this was your family's legacy, would you walk away? Or would you hide it too? Because the truth is, we all come from somewhere. And if you trace any line far enough back, you'll find the same thing: pain, secrecy, and the desperate need to protect what's left. The Whitakers weren't monsters, they were the result of generations of abandonment. People trapped in a valley that time forgot, left to make do with what little they had, even if that meant turning on themselves. And maybe that's the real horror here, not the faces, not the sounds, but the silence. The silence of an entire nation pretending it didn't happen, pretending those people were just rumors. When the first journalist to revisit Odd arrived in the 1990s, he found almost nothing left. just the remnants of a foundation, a few walls swallowed by weeds. But he also found something else, a jar half buried in the dirt, filled with old photographs, faces pressed against the glass, warped and water, damaged but unmistakable. One photo showed a woman sitting on a porch, her eyes sunken, her mouth twisted into something between a smile and a grimace. Behind her, a child stood barefoot, holding what looked like a small animal, though the image was too faded to tell. On the back of that photo, in faded pencil, was a single word, remember. No one knows who wrote it. Maybe one of them, maybe someone who wanted to make sure the world never forgot what it had done, but we did, we always do, and that's why stories like this still matter, because history doesn't vanish, it waits. It waits in the woods, in the ground, in the blood, and sometimes it waits for someone like you to go looking. You could end the story there, call it tragedy, call it history, and move on, but that would be too easy. Because Odd isn't just a name on a lost map, it's a mirror, one that shows us what happens when human beings are left to disappear. When I first came across the files, the ones no one was supposed to see, it wasn't in a library or an archive. It was in a cardboard box, mislabeled, sitting in the corner of a closed county office. The paper smelled like damp earth, and inside, among the census notes and doctor's letters, there was something else. A recording. It was on an old reel-to-reel tape, marked only with the year 1962. When I played it, there was a hiss, then silence, then, faint, almost too soft to hear, a voice, a man's voice, shaking. He said, "If you find this, don't come here, don't talk to them. They don't want help. They don't even know what that word means anymore." There's a pause, then another sound, wet, rhythmic, like someone breathing through water. And then a single word whispered, not from the man, but from someone else. A voice that sounded wrong, like a throat trying to remember how to shape language. Stay. The tape cuts out there. No one knows who recorded it. But after that year, the county removed every reference to Odd from official maps. The road was closed, the land sold under a dummy corporation, and the files sealed under medical confidentiality. That's how America buries its ghosts, with paperwork. But you can't kill memory with ink. You can only drown it for a while, and sometimes it rises again. Locals tell stories of strange visitors showing up in nearby towns, people who don't speak, people whose faces seem off. They don't cause trouble. They just watch, from bus stops, from church steps, from the edge of parking lots late at night. One woman said a man came to her door asking for water. His voice was slurred, like every word took effort. His eyes were pale, unfocused. She gave him a glass, and he stared at it for a long time before setting it down and walking away. When she looked out the window later, he was still standing in the field, facing her house, unmoving. She moved 2 weeks later. It's easy to dismiss these as rumors, but when you start tracing the names, when you follow the faint paper trail that still exists, you find something chilling. The same surnames that once belonged to Odd appear again, scattered across the region. Hospital records, arrest reports, welfare files, the same faces, generation after generation. The bloodline didn't die, it dispersed. And maybe that was the plan, because some of the older locals say that when the state came to relocate the Whitakers, they didn't take them to institutions or shelters. They split them up, sent them to different towns, erased their history. On paper, that looks like mercy. In reality, it was something else. A quiet experiment in erasure. If you scatter the pieces of something broken far enough apart, maybe the world forgets what it looked like when it was whole, but the pieces remember. You can see it in the old photos, the same wide eyes, the same downward tilt of the mouth. You can hear it in the way some locals still refuse to speak about what lies in those hills. And sometimes, when storms roll in from the east, you can feel it. The stillness before thunder, the air too heavy to breathe. Like the land itself is remembering what it tried to forget. A historian once wrote that America is built on silence. He meant the kind that hides under progress, the silences of the dispossessed, the forgotten, the erased. The people who never fit the story we wanted to tell. Odd was one of those silences, and when you look closely enough, you start to realize that it wasn't just one place. There were others, small towns, logging camps, mining settlements that vanished after the veins went dry, communities where poverty and isolation became prisons, and the bloodlines turned inward until there was nowhere left to go. The horror isn't that they existed. The horror is that no one cared until it was too late. In one of the last reports from the area dated 1974, a county official wrote a single line at the bottom of a file, in handwriting almost illegible. "The family persists. God forgive us." Those words haunt me more than the photos ever could, because they suggest something that no one wanted to believe, that the story wasn't over. Maybe it still isn't. Maybe that's why people still see lights in the woods near where Odd used to be, small fires that flicker in places too remote for campers, shadows that move without sound. And maybe that's why, on certain nights, the locals swear they can hear it again. That low, rhythmic clicking echoing from the hollow. You tell yourself it's just animals, wind through the trees, but deep down, you know better. Because something that's been buried that long doesn't die quietly. It lingers. It waits for someone to remember, someone like you. That's the real story of Odd. Not a tale of monsters, but of what happens when a society turns its back on its own. When people become invisible long enough that they start to fade, not just from sight, but from what we call human. And in that fading, something ancient stirs, something that reminds us how thin the line really is between civilization and the wild. Between family and hunger, between love and madness. You can draw the borders, you can build the roads, you can pave over the graves, but the blood remembers, and if you listen closely, really listen, you might still hear it. That clicking sound in the distance, the whisper under the wind, the last breath of a place the world tried to forget, a place called Odd.